the younger generations
Yeah.
will not work in organizations that do not have substantial, things around how we can help them find well-being. 7 habits of success.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Duct Tape Marketing Podcast. This is John Jantz. My guest today is Kory Kogon. She's FranklinCovey's Vice President of Content Development and a Senior Leadership Consultant. With over 25 years of business expertise from the frontline to the executive team, she understands the application of FranklinCovey's world-renowned content within organizations, including the strategy and principles necessary to build great leaders, systems, and winning cultures. So we're going to talk a little bit about, this is almost a revisit. We're going to talk a little bit about the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, a book that actually came out last century, has sold millions and millions of copies, and certainly rings as true today as probably ever. So Kory, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, John. It's a pleasure.
So you continue to evolve and create content around the whole 7 habits concept, but give me a little bit of what's your history with FranklinCovey, with the 7 habits kind of library.
Well, I will take you back just a skosh before that. I've been with FranklinCovey for 18 years.
Okay.
So had the pleasure and honor of knowing Stephen before he passed away in 2012. But prior to that, I was the vice president of worldwide operations for a global franchise company. And so myself and the CEO ensured that we had a 7 habits culture.
Yeah.
It was a franchise organization, and around the world, a 7 habits culture. And so my familiarity started there, and it was only sort of by accident, but not really, that I ended up at FranklinCovey. And so as a consultant first, and then as part of the practices around productivity and leadership. So my familiarity with 7 habits goes way back to implementation within small businesses, and then bringing that practical business experience with me to FranklinCovey to blend it with things like the 7 habits to really help organizations across sectors move forward. So that's a little bit about my journey.
So whenever an author or we're talking about a book that's like 200 ways to do X or 7 habits or whatever, whatever the number might be, I always like to tease people and say, do you have a favorite? Do you have a favorite of the habits?
Yes, I do. Habit 1. Habit 1, be proactive, which is the habit of choice. And I'll tell, again, very practical, very pragmatic. I'm an operations executive. Stephen talks about being proactive, not reactive. So as a leader in particular, or as an individual contributor, being reactive to everything, makes you come off as victimized and, not as somebody who makes things happen. And Stephen talks about the space between stimulus and response. And that's why it's my favorite, because if I'm good at, okay, something's triggering me, before I hit the send button, can I count to 10 and think about what outcome I really want? Yeah. It's my whole career has been like that. That to me, that's being proactive, and it saved me both personally and professionally many times. So habit 1 is very foundational, and truly for me, it is totally my favorite one.
Well, and I recall in interviewing both Stephen and his son, Stephen H.M. Is that right? H.M.?
Stephen H.R.
Oh, H.R. Sorry. Got that
I'm
wrong.
sorry. Stephen R. Covey.
Stephen M.R. Boy, we both are messing it up. Stephen M.R. I remember some reference to Viktor Frankl in his work, actually, in that particular habit.
And again, just, we say you have the power to choose your response. And again, Viktor Frankl was a terrible experience. And just, we learned a lot from how he handled the circumstances he was, he was in. So you choose, you get very self-aware that, we call it emotional intelligence in this day and age, self-awareness. Get very self-aware to just before you, whatever circumstance you're in, how can I think about how to deal with it, live through it. So
between stimulus and response, there's a moment, and in that moment lies our freedom.
There you go.
I think is the actual quote. Would you say, because of your familiarity, sort of a long familiarity with the work, has the world changed in a way that has changed any of those habits? Have any of those habits become more relevant? Just kind of talk to me a little bit about the evolution, I guess, of over 35 years.
Yeah. So, the thing about the seven habits is that it is principle based.
Right.
And I was just rereading this morning Dr. Covey's, when he was asked these questions, I was reading a transcript of an interview, and he was so clear before he passed away in 2012, and we feel the same today. So even we just spent millions of dollars in relaunching and contemporizing the workshop, the course around the
Yeah.
seven habits, and the habits didn't change, the principles didn't change, just how we applied them in a contemporary way that people really can consume and remember and do something with. So it's how you point these principles and habits. And as Stephen would say, as the more turbulent, the more challenging the world gets, the more important these habits and principles are. And that's a true statement.
So you didn't ask me to, but I'm going to tell you my favorite, and that is seek first to understand, then to be understood. I think that a lot of miscommunication, I asked the question about has the world evolved or changed? I feel like we're in this moment where that habit is probably more important than I can ever remember it being.
I really appreciate that. And I didn't want to interrupt you before, so I didn't ask you that question. And I've taught this hundreds of thousands of times, I think, and keynoting it now and speaking to groups as we're relaunching and since the pandemic. I'm with you, John, because with the remote hybrid, the state of the world, there's a lot of pain going on. And whether personal or professional, if you are not listening empathically to others, seeking first to understand, and putting yourself in others' shoes, and sort of not absorbing, but acknowledging the pain they might be in or the excitement that they're in, and really understanding them without trying to fix things and do the whole autobiographical listening thing, everything, giving them space and empathy to really feel safe, to be able to have a conversation and move to. So I'm with you. It has become critical that whether you're in a family, in a small business or a big business, that you are listening to each other deeply.
Yeah, I remember a story from the book that really, I remember drove that point home so much that, we have absolutely especially a stranger, we have absolutely no idea what's going on in their life. Right. And there was a story about a man on a bus, and he had, I don't know if you recall it, but there were children just that were being unruly, and he wasn't paying attention to them at all. And everybody thought how rude that was, and he should take, those children and take care of them. Well, turns out the story is his wife has just passed, and, nobody, you have no idea what is going on in somebody's life. And I think that probably, that story and that lesson really probably, or that principle really probably impacted me at a really early time in my career, probably more than anything.
Yeah, it's a classic story around a paradigm. And Stephen says, I was like, why doesn't he get a hold of his kids? Whatever. And then and so he had a paradigm shift. Right. And that is really the basis of the seven habits, is how do we help people become very aware that the way we think about things may not be exactly that, and how we behave and show up in the world. Maybe if we were open to examining our paradigms, we could make good changes that make us more effective and don't go down those kinds of rabbit holes like Stephen did. That kind of assumption.
Yeah. So book was probably the first place I was introduced. I mean, maybe the whole 4-quadrant thing has been around since consulting was invented, right? But it was the first place where I really saw a clear picture of the idea of, the stuff that's nagging you, but it's not important. And, the important stuff that is, also needs to be done, right? Or is the most impactful. That idea of, I don't think he called it time management necessarily, but it was really more along the lines of, if you just stay focused on the important stuff that's actually going to be high payoff, then that's probably all you need to focus on.
Yeah, so that's habit 3, first things first. And that became so popular and important, he sort of blew that up into a bigger book. And first it was achieving focus, achieving highest priorities. Now we have the 5 choices, the path to extraordinary productivity. And the time matrix is a core part of that, because, and he did call it time management, it's a time matrix where you really have a process by which you can synthesize. Let me get really clear on what's most important. And then how do I make sure that I'm mitigating or eliminating the things that may be less or not important. So your brain needs a process.
Yeah.
And so the time matrix is really helpful to that.
Well, and we work with a lot of entrepreneurs. Some of them are solopreneurs, and what gets in the way with them so often is, there's things that they're doing that they shouldn't be doing at all. But then there's certainly things that somebody else, bookkeeping is one of my great examples, get that off your plate, delegate that. There's lots of people who actually enjoy doing that. And I think that once people get to the point where they're like, yeah, I shouldn't be doing this, that's not important, I can delegate this because frankly, I don't like doing it anyway. Then all of a sudden you're like, okay, maybe I do have the time for the important stuff.
It is. I'm sorry.
I was just going to say it's hard for people though, because, we're just so focused on like, oh no, this thing is yelling in my ear, so I better do it.
Yeah. And, I like to call it, from the neuroscience world, labeling and reappraising. If I just take the time to really write down what's important, because I'll tell you, even, and working in, I pass in the franchise business and helping support small businesses, we found that some of the entrepreneurs would do bookkeeping or go sweep the floor because they didn't want to go out and sell. So
Right.
they sort of knew, right? So there's a whole psychology, around some of that. And when you have a framework and you have a process, and again, that's what effectiveness is all about. What are the tools that can support how I can get really clear on what's important and come to terms with those things that maybe I shouldn't be doing, because if I don't do that, I'm not going to achieve my end in mind of a successful business.
How have you seen leaders? Because sometimes when you read some of these kind of bigger principles, they feel very much like leadership training and leadership skills, right? But, in an effective organization, we have to also drive those down throughout. So how have you found leaders have been effective at not just embracing this, but, not, because there is kind of a danger of buying courses and buying, it's like, here, go to this stuff, right? But, how have you seen organizations make 7 Habits almost a culture?
It's a very good question, because it's not easy, right? I mean, it's a very real question you're asking. We've had clients that I can't name here, but that have been with us for 25 years as 7 Habits companies. And we were in my prior organization as well, and we made it part of the culture. What we know, I'll tell you what my executive chairman used to say, Kory, if you want to win a championship game, you can't just read a book, even if it's 7 Habits. You can't just read a book or watch a video. You need he said, if you want to win the game, I'm not going to say to you, Kory, go watch a video on how to throw the ball and show up on Saturday to play the big game, right? And so our whole philosophy is around that. And with the 7 Habits, it's a surround sound. It's how do we... And, Stephen, created the maturity continuum to give you an accessible, memorable framework, and the see, do, get model around behavior change. And beyond that, it's how do we consume or digest these principles and the pragmatic practices that go along with it, and really encourage people to practice it and speak the language over time. And so what's the sustained learning to really turn it into a culture? And I think that small wins along the way really help that. So our organizations really, they have posters up, they're speaking the language, they're behaving what they're learning, and small fires with groups of people people look in and go, hey, wait, what are they doing? Because it looks like they're doing great. I want some of that.
Yeah.
So, it takes work, but it's certainly doable. We've had some great organizations that really, everybody speaks the language of the 7 Habits.
So to me, over the last 20 years, one of the most gratifying things to see is, a lot of the things that were talked about in this book, time management, better leadership skills, better communication skills, are all things seen as kind of hard skills for leaders to learn. This book was really one of the first that, the 7th habit, sharpen the saw, that, mind, body, spirit maybe are all a part of this in terms of you being effective. And one of the most gratifying things I've seen is over the last 20 years, that's become a very mainstream thought as well, hasn't it?
Well-being, right? So well-being more than ever, as people are working harder than ever and all of that. So we still, even in our new program, it is, you have to sharpen the saw. And Stephen always said it, again, even reading this morning, he said, the more high tech, the more high touch. Do a lot of work around the implementation of AI and human capability and hybrid intelligence and all that. And I read that and I thought, he was so before his time. on it. Well-being is key. Sharpen the saw. He said you can't do the first 6 habits without sharpening, because I find it incredibly difficult to pause and just be the kind of person I should be, whether it's at home or at work. And so, but it is right at the top. The younger generations will not work in organizations that do not have substantial, things around how are you going to help me with my well-being? 7 habits or no 7 habits. It's a mandate.
Yeah, and I think that was brought into sharp focus, I think, after the pandemic. The whole quiet quitting thing that people talked about, a lot of it was like, I'm not getting recharged here. I think I've made a decision to leave. So I think that habit is one that a lot more companies are at least coming to terms with.
Absolutely. And all kinds of quiet quitting, the resignation, all of those things. And even with the economy changing and, companies doing some layoffs and all of that, the younger generations are not going back. I mean, it is really significant for them to have a sense that an organization will care about their well-being. And I know there's organizations today out there that are like, no, you need to work 24 hours a day or you can't work here, and people will make their choices. But principally, humans have to sharpen the saw. And that's why that's a timeless principle at a very timely point in the world right now.
Yeah. And it's funny. It's one that people say, oh, I don't really have time to do that. Well, I think science proves it, but anecdotally, I can tell you if I exercise, I do better work, right? And so, I take the hour to do that, I'm going to be way more productive the next 3-4 hours, doing the work. So while it may seem counterintuitive, it's certainly, science backs it, as a way to actually be more productive.
Yeah. And in the new course, we even have in there just a little research on, the detriment of back-to-back Zoom meetings or and the stress levels by not taking breaks. So, I mean, it's really critical. And whether it's leaders or personally, we can't see it. It's like Stephen, if you remember the famous line, he said, are you too busy driving your car to stop to get gas? It's the same thing here. We're so into our overwhelm, we can't see it. And unfortunately, we know that statistically, we know that over half of people will not do something about burnout until they are burnt out.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like boiling the frog. You don't realize it because it just happens gradually and then it happens all at once.
Right. It's a very timeless principle.
That's right. So, Kory, I appreciate you taking a moment to stop by the Duct Tape Marketing Podcast. Is there somewhere you'd invite people to tell us a little bit about how somebody can consume the course or where they might find out more?
Sure. Simply just go to www.FranklinCovey.com and it will probably on the homepage, you'll probably see a lot about our launch, if not just search 7 habits, but it should come right up for you, right in the middle of a big launch world tour right now. So thanks, John, for asking.
Awesome. All right. Well, again, I appreciate you stopping by the podcast and hopefully we'll run into you one of these days out there on the road.